The United States and Canada, two vast adjoining nations. But imagine if that border wasn't quite so fixed. What if specific states, perhaps disenchanted with Washington's political climate or attracted by Canada's perceived steadiness, genuinely seceded? It might sound far-fetched, correct? However, the reality is that certain states already possess profound economic, cultural, and even political links to Canada. Consider this. What if Vermont fully embraced its independent character and departed? What if Minnesota's northern allure felt a greater kinship with Canada? And Alaska? It's already geographically separated from the contiguous United States. Some of these notions might take you by surprise, but for others, the indicators are already present. Let's explore this phenomenon. In a world brimming with significant global occurrences, it's easy to overlook the subtle shifts happening closer to home. Today, we're examining a truly intriguing, albeit speculative scenario involving the relationship between the United States and its northern neighbor, Canada. Could certain U.S. states actually consider leaving the Union to become part of Canada? The idea itself prompts a cascade of questions about identity, economy, and political allegiance. We encourage you to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Your support is crucial for helping us bring more content like this to light. Also, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We'll be delving into the factors that make this seemingly improbable idea worth discussing, and we promise to offer some concluding thoughts at the end of this exploration. Number 10. Vermont. What if an entire state already felt a stronger connection to Canada than to the rest of the U.S.? You might immediately associate Vermont with maple syrup, picturesque small towns, and crisp autumn air. But guess what? Those very characteristics are part of why Vermont could potentially be the first to bid farewell to America. This state boasts a long heritage of independence. It once existed as its own republic before formally joining the Union in 1791. This historical precedent underscores a persistent independent streak within the state's identity. Politically, Vermont leans significantly towards progressive policies, mirroring the political landscape often associated with its northern neighbor, Canada. The state's policy choices frequently align more closely with Canadian approaches than with prevailing trends in Washington, D.C. But here's where the narrative becomes particularly compelling. Some residents already desire separation. A movement known as the Second Vermont Republic has actively advocated for secession for years. Their argument centers on the belief that the state would prosper more effectively on its own, free from the constraints and political dynamics of the larger federal system. Adding to this are strong trade connections, particularly with Quebec. Vermont shares a love for social programs similar to Canada's, and possesses an economy built on industries, like agriculture, tourism, and renewable energy, that harmonize well with Canada's economic structure. When you combine Vermont's independent history, its progressive political alignment, the existence of an active secessionist movement, and its significant economic and cultural ties to Quebec, the notion of Vermont breaking away suddenly appears less fantastical. Could this represent America's first genuine secession in centuries? The question hangs in the air, fueled by a unique blend of history, culture, and economics. Number 9. Maine. You might be astonished to discover that one U.S. state already relies heavily on Canada for its very survival. Without its northern neighbor, this state would face immense challenges in keeping the lights on, quite literally. That's because Maine imports a substantial portion of its electricity directly from Quebec. This energy dependence highlights a critical vulnerability and a deep-seated connection. Furthermore, its economy flourishes due to cross-border trade. In fact, goods worth over $3 billion flow between Maine and Canada annually. This significant economic interdependence underscores the vital role Canada plays in Maine's prosperity. But guess what? Culturally, Maine already resonates more with Canadian sensibilities than with those of many other American states. Its rugged coastline, close-knit fishing communities, and presence of French-speaking populations create a cultural milieu that shares more in common with neighboring New Brunswick than, for example, Texas. The lifestyle, the maritime heritage, and even linguistic ties contribute to this sense of affinity. Even in the political sphere, Maine's policies often align more closely with Canada's approach than with the directives coming from Washington. The state frequently adopts stances on environmental issues and social policies that echo Canadian perspectives. And let's not overlook history. Maine was once part of Massachusetts until it separated in 1820. If it could make such a move once, asserting its distinct identity, who's to say it couldn't contemplate a similar shift again under different circumstances? The combination of energy dependence, substantial trade, cultural similarities, and a history of separation paints a picture of a state deeply intertwined with its Canadian neighbor. Please, take a moment to watch this video through to the end, as we'll be summarizing our findings and drawing conclusions. And don't forget to drop a comment letting us know which city or country you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the globe. Number 8, New Hampshire. What if a state that prides itself immensely on freedom decided to push that concept one step further? Live free or die isn't merely a catchy slogan on a license plate. For New Hampshire, it represents a fundamental way of life. New Hampshire has consistently demonstrated a fiercely independent character, marked by its low taxes, notably, no general sales tax or personal income tax, a robust libertarian movement, and policies that frequently diverge from the mainstream of the United States. This independent spirit is deeply ingrained in the state's political culture. But what if this very independence steered it away from America entirely? It already resists federal control more assertively than many other states, fights vigorously against high taxes, and places a high value on personal freedom above almost all else. Does that sound familiar? That's because New Hampshire stands out as one of the most fiercely independent states within the nation. And guess what? Some of its residents are already engaging in discussions about secession. This isn't just some fringe hypothetical theory. In 2022, a group of lawmakers actually introduced an amendment to the state constitution. This proposed amendment would have placed the question of peaceful secession from the United States on the ballot for voters to decide. Although the amendment did not pass, the mere fact that it was formally debated within the state legislature is significant. It signals a level of discontent and a willingness to consider radical alternatives that is noteworthy. New Hampshire has always carved its own path. With no income tax, no sales tax, and the enduring live free or die mentality, its ethos sometimes seems more aligned with the decentralized governance model found in parts of Canada than with the federal oversight emanating from Washington. Combine this fierce independence with existing economic ties to Canada. Over $8 billion in trade flows between them annually, and the presence of a secessionist sentiment, however nascent, and the picture becomes even more intriguing. Could this potent mix of libertarian ideals, economic links, and political discussion pave the way for a future where New Hampshire seriously considers leaving the U.S.? While extreme, in a state where independence is a core tenet, perhaps anything is possible. Number 7. Minnesota. You'd likely be surprised to learn that one U.S. state is already so interconnected with Canada that departing from America might actually seem logical. It maintains profound economic relationships, a shared cultural sensibility, and a populace that, believe it or not, is sometimes mistaken for being Canadian. That state? Minnesota. Let's dissect this further. Minnesota shares a nearly 550-mile border with Canada, and its most significant trading partner is, indeed, Canada. In 2023 alone, Minnesota exported goods valued at over $7 billion across that border. This figure highlights Canada's role as an economic lifeline for the state's economy. However, the connection extends beyond mere financial transactions. Minnesota and Canada share a similar lifestyle. The inhabitants are often characterized as friendly, lovers of the outdoors, and recognized for their distinct accents and passion for hockey, traits often associated with their Canadian neighbors. The climate? Brutally cold, much like Canada's. And the political landscape? Often more aligned with progressive Canadian policies than with conservative American approaches. And guess what? There's historical context here too. Before Minnesota officially achieved statehood in 1858, portions of its territory were actually governed by the British. Furthermore, its foundational fur trade industry was heavily dependent on connections with Canada, Even in the present day, numerous Minnesotans possess dual citizenship or maintain close familial ties with Canadians just across the border. Some experts speculate that if the United States were ever to face severe political turmoil or economic collapse, Minnesota would be among the first states to seriously evaluate alternative arrangements. Given its deep-seated connections to Canada, economically, culturally, and historically, it wouldn't be entirely shocking if some Minnesotans began looking northward instead of westward for their future alignment, should circumstances drastically change. Number 6. North Dakota. What if an entire state relied more on a foreign nation than its own federal government? It sounds almost absurd, until you consider the situation in North Dakota. This state might appear to be a tranquil, somewhat overlooked segment of America, but guess what? Its economy is practically fused with Canada's. Here's where the situation becomes truly remarkable. North Dakota exports more goods to Canada than to any other single country, a staggering $6 billion worth annually. This isn't just minor trade, it's a fundamental pillar of the state's economic structure. And the ties go beyond commerce. Consider energy. Canada provides a huge portion of North Dakota's power supply. Agriculture is another key link. North Dakota's farmers are heavily reliant on Canadian buyers to sustain their businesses. Even travel patterns reflect this deep connection. A surprising number of North Dakota residents regularly cross the border into Canada for essential services like healthcare, as well as for shopping and employment opportunities. In some border towns, spotting a Canadian license plate is just as common, if not more so, than seeing an American one. But let's delve into the political dimension. North Dakota's emphasis on small government, its pro-business mindset, and its close trade relationships actually align more closely with the political and economic philosophies of Canada's western provinces, particularly Alberta and Saskatchewan, than they do with the political center in Washington, D.C. And here's a fascinating historical footnote. At one point in history, there were serious discussions about North Dakota and the Canadian province of Manitoba merging to form a unified economic zone. While this merger never materialized, the very idea hasn't entirely faded from regional consciousness. So, what might happen if the United States were to encounter significant political or economic instability? North Dakota is already profoundly dependent on Canada. Could it one day contemplate making that connection official? It sounds shocking, but when a state's primary lifeline is a foreign country, the question inevitably arises. Why maintain loyalty to a system that perhaps doesn't fully recognize or prioritize its unique position? Number 5. Montana. What if a state shared more common ground with Canada than with the rest of the United States? What if its rugged, independent ethos led it to question whether remaining part of America was the optimal path? That's precisely the situation unfolding in Montana. Here's the reality. Montana already functions much like a Canadian province in many respects. It shares an extensive 545-mile border with the Canadian provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. But here's the crucial point. These provinces aren't merely adjacent territories. They are vital economic partners. In 2023, Montana exported goods worth over $700 million to Canada, establishing Canada as one of the state's most significant trading partners. Culturally, the parallels are striking as well. The people of Montana live and breathe the outdoors, much like their Canadian counterparts across the border. Whether the activity is ranching, hunting, or enduring harsh winters, Montanans and Canadians in the neighboring provinces share a similar lifestyle and set of values shaped by the vast, challenging landscape. Some even jest that Alberta and Montana are essentially the same place, with the primary difference being Canada's universal healthcare system. And here's the element often overlooked. Montana is home to a potent anti-federal government sentiment. Many Montanans feel that Washington ignores their needs and concerns. Some would prefer to align with a system that better reflects their values and economic realities. This undercurrent of dissatisfaction, combined with the deep economic and cultural ties to Canada, creates a unique dynamic. If circumstances ever became sufficiently strained within the U.S., who's to say Montana wouldn't look north instead of east for its future? The historical precedent for Montana's connection lies in the shared frontier history and the early dominance of Canadian companies, like the Hudson's Bay Company, in the region's fur trade. Even today, many Montanans hold dual citizenship or have strong family connections across the border. The idea of shifting allegiance might seem radical, but the foundations for such a consideration are arguably already in place. Number 4. Washington. Why does this state seem more connected to its northern neighbor than to the rest of the U.S.? Why are its largest cities already financially, politically, and culturally intertwined with another nation? Washington state might be celebrated for its tech industry and coffee culture, but beneath the surface, significant forces are at play, forces that could reshape its future. Washington isn't just geographically close to Canada, it's deeply linked in ways that might make one question its long-term trajectory within the U.S. Could a shift towards Canada be more plausible than many assume? The evidence warrants consideration. Let's examine the numbers. Washington's number 1 trading partner? Canada. In 2023 alone, goods valued at over $20 billion moved between Washington and Canada. This isn't insignificant pocket change. It represents a full-blown economic dependency. But the connection transcends mere trade. Washington relies heavily on Canadian energy, with substantial amounts of hydroelectric power flowing south from British Columbia. Even its largest port, Seattle, is profoundly linked to Canadian shipping routes, facilitating the movement of millions of dollars worth of goods between Asia and North America via Canadian corridors. But here's where it gets even more compelling. Washington isn't just financially tied to Canada. It's politically aligned too. It stands as one of the most progressive states in the U.S., with policies concerning health care, environmental protection, and social services that often appear more Canadian than American in their approach. Washington has actively pursued closer ties with British Columbia, including proposals for high-speed rail infrastructure that would connect Seattle and Vancouver in under 2 hours. Some politicians have even proposed deeper economic integration. And guess what? The cultural overlap is undeniable. From Vancouver to Seattle, residents share the same affinity for the outdoor lifestyle, operate within a similar tech-driven economy, and harbor a mutual love for coffee. In fact, many British Columbians live and work in Washington while still considering Canada their home. If the U.S. were to face a significant political division, it wouldn't be surprising if Washington started looking north rather than east, given these deep and multifaceted connections. Number 3. Oregon. What if a state felt so disconnected from the rest of its country that it began exploring alternative futures? What if its people, culture, and economy seemed more in sync with another nation? This is the scenario playing out in Oregon, and the potential shift is more significant than most people grasp. First, let's consider the economics. Oregon's economy is heavily reliant on trade with Canada, with over $4 billion in goods moving between them annually. This economic interdependence forms a strong foundation, but the connections run deeper. Oregon shares closer environmental and social policy alignments with British Columbia than with many of its U.S. neighbors. The state's positions on health care, sustainability initiatives, and labor rights often mirror Canadian approaches more than traditional American ones. Portland and Vancouver, Canada, not Washington, are practically twins in many respects. From their shared outdoor lifestyles to their progressive political leanings, the two cities feel more connected to each other than Portland does to, say, Texas or Florida. And guess what? There's already a movement reflecting this disconnect. You've likely heard of the Greater Idaho movement, where several rural Oregon counties are actively seeking to leave Oregon and become part of Idaho, citing political and cultural differences with the more liberal western parts of the state. But here's the intriguing twist. While eastern Oregon looks towards Idaho, some residents in western Oregon argue that their region would be better off aligning with Canada, specifically British Columbia. It sounds extreme, but when a state experiences internal divisions and its progressive core constantly clashes with the federal government's direction, at what point do people start looking for a system that truly reflects their values? Considering the geography, the economic ties, the policy similarities, and the existing secessionist sentiment, albeit focused on Idaho for now, don't be shocked if, amidst a major U.S. crisis, Oregonians seriously considered looking north instead of south or east for their future allegiance. Number 2. Alaska. How can a state even identify as American when it's physically detached from the rest of the country? How does it maintain its connection when its economy, military operations, and daily existence are more deeply interwoven with another nation? Alaska might be known as America's last frontier, but delve deeper, and you'll see just how profoundly tied it is to Canada. Could it ever realistically break away? The indicators might surprise you. Let's begin with geography. Alaska is closer to Canada than it is to the contiguous U.S. mainland. Significantly so. In fact, the only way to drive from Alaska to the lower 48 states is by traversing through Canada. This geographic isolation isn't just a matter of distance. It shapes reality. Alaska is deeply connected to Canada's economy, with billions of dollars flowing between them through trade in oil, seafood, and raw materials. Some of Alaska's largest fishing operations depend on access to Canadian waters, and Canadian companies hold substantial interests in Alaska's natural resource sectors. But here's where things get particularly interesting. Alaska was actually part of Russia before being purchased by the United States. While seemingly unrelated to Canada, this historical fact establishes a crucial point. Alaska hasn't always been American territory. Its allegiance has shifted before. Consider the military presence. Alaska hosts some of the most strategically vital U.S. military bases. However, Canada plays an integral role in joint defense initiatives. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, integrates both Alaskan and Canadian forces. This implies that in the event of a major geopolitical shift, Alaska and Canada would likely coordinate their actions closely, perhaps even before involving the rest of the U.S. So, if a time ever arrives when the United States no longer feels like the appropriate affiliation for Alaska, don't be surprised if this state weighs its options carefully. Given its geographic reality, its deep economic roots with Canada, its history of belonging to another nation, and its integrated military posture, looking north might seem like a more natural direction than remaining tied to a distant mainland, especially if the U.S. faced significant political upheaval. Because when you're already operating somewhat like an independent nation, heavily reliant on your neighbor, making it official isn't such an outlandish thought. Number 1. Michigan. You'd be astonished at how deeply connected this state is to Canada, so much so that it almost feels like an extension of it already. Michigan relies on Canada more intensely than any other U.S. state. A staggering $80 billion in trade flows across the Michigan-Canada border annually. Detroit and Windsor are essentially one massive cross-border industrial hub, with thousands of transport trucks making the crossing every single day. If this critical connection were ever severed, Michigan's economy would face catastrophic consequences almost instantaneously. And guess what? The automotive industry, Michigan's economic cornerstone, is profoundly dependent on Canada. Factories in Detroit and Windsor are so integrated that some vehicles are assembled using parts manufactured in both nations. If you've ever owned a Ford, Chevrolet, or Chrysler, there's a significant probability it was constructed with Canadian labor or components. But the ties aren't solely economic. Michigan and Canada share vital infrastructure, including bridges like the Ambassador Bridge, the busiest border crossing between the two countries, owned by a Canadian billionaire, tunnels, and interconnected power grids. The state relies on Canadian electricity to meet its energy needs. And here's a startling historical fact. Michigan once seriously contemplated merging with Canada. Following the Toledo War in the 1800s, some Michiganders genuinely preferred joining Canada over remaining with the United States. While that path wasn't taken, the underlying sentiment of connection hasn't vanished. With its economy, energy supply, infrastructure, and even historical inclinations so closely tied to Canada, could Michigan one day reconsider its position within the U.S.? It sounds incredible, until you recognize that it's already functioning, in many ways, like a Canadian province economically. The deep integration across multiple sectors makes the U.S.-Canada border seem almost porous in this region. So, Could these states actually secede and join Canada? At first glance, it seems like pure fantasy, but when you examine the economic dependencies, the cultural affinities, the shared infrastructure, the political alignments, and even the historical precedents, the connections are undeniable and profound. From economies inextricably linked to Canada for survival, to cultural and political landscapes that mirror their northern neighbor more than their own country, these states already exist in a space much closer to Canada than most realize. History demonstrates that borders are not immutable, nations evolve, and allegiances can shift. What appears impossible in the present political climate could become tomorrow's reality under different circumstances. Should the United States ever face a major political or economic crisis that fundamentally alters its internal cohesion, who can definitively say that some of these states, already looking northward in so many ways, wouldn't make a dramatic, perhaps even logical move? The potential is there, woven into the very fabric of their existence. What are your thoughts? Could any of these states genuinely leave the U.S. to become part of Canada? Share your perspective in the comments below. And please remember to subscribe, like, and share this video. Your engagement helps us continue creating thought-provoking content like this. Until next time.